Good morning. Ready? Good morning. We will now open up the public hearing on Senate Bill 49 and recognize the prime sponsor, Senator Tim Lang. Welcome to Ways and Means.
Thank you, members of Ways and Means. And again, this is still my favorite committee. You can tell by how much time I'm spending here, and I'm still a state senator as I was earlier. This bill in front of you, Senate Bill 49, is a pretty straightforward bill. It came out of a study committee that Representative Ulrey and I served on from last year, in Senate Bill 330, that looked at OPLC. There were 3 bills that were generated out of that study committee, this being one of them. The idea was, as many of you know, that we have that 125% rule relative to fees that are charged, that we're not allowed, that we're supposed to recover our costs and up to 25% more, but not more than that, or the Supreme Court's ruled that it's a tax versus a fee. And so in OPLC, we ran into the issue where our licensing fees that we were covering were exceeding the amount of expenditure, and we were lapsing money back into the general fund. So in 2019, we lapsed 3.4 million. In 2020, we lapsed 3.3 million. 21, we lapsed 4.1, and this year we lapsed in 22 it was 2.6. So every year we're lapsing monies back to the general fund, but the idea behind a fee is that it's supposed to go to serve the person who paid the fee. And this is going to general fund monies to use for whatever this legislature decides, and not the person who paid the fee. So the idea behind this bill is to make sure that fees go back to help the person paying the fee, in this case the licensees, so that if the agency collects more money than anticipated, it will use any excess money to lower the cost of licenses, not to just fund the general fund. So that's the short version of the bill. The Senate amended my original bill, to add a reporting requirement. The idea that we had when I put this bill forward was that I was expecting the commissioner of OPLC to put basically a 10-year plan out, right? Is like, this is what we expect to kind of spend money on in the next 10 years. And so just like in all of our cities, towns, school districts, we have capital reserve funds that we put money in because we know we got a roofing project or something like that, that the idea of this reserve fund would that they would be able to slowly build a fund if they knew they were going to be doing a large multi-million-dollar expenditure, or even smaller projects, million-dollar expenditures, but over the next 5 or 6 years, they could plan for those expenditures and not create spiking in fees, where all of a sudden they've got to do an ERP, enterprise resource planning upgrade, software upgrade. That's a $5 million bump. And because they're self-funded, they got to go raise everybody's fees to cover the $5 million. We didn't want to do that, where we create a spike in the fee and then we drop it back down. So the idea was to create this non-lapsing fund to allow them to put money in, identify their 10-year plan, and then use this funding for that 10-year plan without having to affect licensures. And then also recognize that anything that wasn't needed for the 10-year plan would be used to lower licensure fees. So that was the bill. The Senate added the reporting requirement. The House added the cap. I'm not a great fan of the cap. I would like to see the director be able to put a 10-year plan together and say that this is how we expect we might be using some of these funds. That would define the cap. And then if we wanted to come back and put a cap on after she's had the opportunity to do that, I think that would be smart. But the House chose to put the $3 million cap on, which is, I think, what you did with your version of this bill as well. But my preference is not to have a cap, and at least give the director the opportunity to put a 10-year plan together that will stabilize the license fees.
Thank you very much. Would you be open to questions from the
Absolutely.
committee? Representative Platt.
Yes, educate me, please, Senator Lang. We have a House bill that does the same thing.
I think you tabled it.
Oh, did we? Okay, thanks.
Representative Elberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for taking the question. I'm curious about whether we are consistent, whether this bill and the idea of returning funds to lowering licensing fees is consistent or different from other industries. For example, the Liquor Commission, if they have excess, do they use it to lower licensing fees?
So thank you for the question. So again, I'm not sure that liquor has any licensing fees, but what liquor does do is they are again a self-funded agency, so they pay for their own buildings and they pay for their own. So again, when they build out a brand new building, I'll use the example in Tilton, right? There's built a brand new building a couple of years ago, right? That long-term bond, that long-term mortgage is paid for out of liquor fees because they're a self-funded agency. So I don't believe liquor has any licensing fees that they could turn back to a taxpayer. It's all done. But liquor also manages the price of liquor in the state of New Hampshire. And so they help, you know, as you can tell by the latest report, which said that New Hampshire has the highest liquor per capita in the nation. They seem to do a pretty good they do a pretty good job at managing pricing to encourage people to buy here in the state.
Follow up.
Thank you. And I'm wondering if this is more for us rather than for Senator Lang. Are there any other situations where there are licensing fees, and would there be parallel situations with those groups where excess funds are returned as lowering those fees, or would all of those fees stay in the general fund? I'm don't know.
Yeah, I can tell you that lots of agencies have licensing fees. Liquor definitely does. I can tell you for sure.
Yeah.
And they stay in liquor. This is different. This is a unique situation. This is the OPLC. So this is the Office of Professional Licensure. So this is a different category. So none of the others that I'm aware of go back to the general fund. But I'll just throw that out on the liquor side. And I saw some hands over here. First of all, Representative Ulrich, yours is up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if I'm reading this correctly, the difference is that the House bill did not have the reporting requirement, and the House bill did not have a split cap dividing it three, and let's say for us, so let's set it 5, let's say 2, just for numbers. So we split it up in that fashion. Is that correct?
So my understanding is, so you're right on the reporting requirement. And the second aspect was there was a cap put in the House, but again, anything over the cap went to the general fund. This specifies that anything over the cap must be used to lower fees.
So follow up, Madam Chair.
Follow up.
So you're using the $3 million for capital improvements and investments, and anything left over that, so that if the agent OPLC spends $1 million on a new computer software upgrade, whatever, overpriced, but just numbers, for that would leave $2 million of the $3 million of the cap, and all of that money would then also go towards reducing the fees, because it would go back into the operating budget of the OPLC, which would then reduce the fees before anything went to the general fund.
So in this model, in this bill, the way the Senate ED&A and the House ED&A modified the bill, no money ever goes to the general fund. In this bill, there's a $3 million cap that they can hold at the end of the biennium. If there's more than $3 million they've received rather than expended, then they can hold that $3 million. They can choose not to. They can only hold $2 million and say, we're going to put $1 million back into lowering fees too. Nothing requires them to hit the cap before they do that, but they're allowed to keep up to $3 million in there for long-term planning, be able to do your capital expenditures and anything that is over that. So, let's say they brought in $3.5 million. So they kept the $3 million and $500,000 that they have left. They would be required under this bill to take that $500,000 and lower licensing fees over the next biennium by $500,000 for our nurses and our electricians and plumbers and all the people who get a OPLC license.
One more follow-up, Madam Chair.
Follow up.
So choose your 3.5. So you now get $500,000 goes into reducing the fees. That would be applied, and this would probably be a question for the OPLC administrative staff as to how is that going to be divided up equally, or where set up in their operating rules in some fashion. That's a little gray right now.
So again, having served on that committee with you, what we learned was that each board is basically assigned a cost, for lack of a better phrase. How much administrative time they use. It's a prorated cost based on the entire cost of OPLC. They're assigned a cost, and from that cost is what they define licensure from. So my expectation, I'm sure the commission will correct me if I'm wrong, is that if there's $500,000 left over, that would be prorated to each board based on the fee that would be charged to them for running that board by OPLC. That makes sense? I'm not sure if that got a little confusing, but
No, Madam Chair, if I may. No. If I'm correct is the key word on that.
Representative Almy.
Thank you. Boy, a number of things about this. You're defining as capital expenditures, purchase of software. Is that normally considered to be a capital expense?
I actually,
Sometimes, yes.
my apologize. Could you restate the question?
On is purchase of software, which is the only major expense that is left, it seems to me, on a capital expense.
So again, I think capital expenditure is usually defined by a dollar amount. I'm not sure what the dollar amount in the state of New Hampshire is. I think it's for the purposes of like just a contract with the executive council, isn't it $5,000? Anything over a $5,000 expenditure would have to go outside and go to a separate expenditure. So would go in front of the. So I would view this at especially considering they have 100 and some odd employees, that something like an ERP, planning process, a customer service process that allows them documentation. You're talking a multi-million-dollar project. Having been in the technology industry, I can tell you that a software upgrade for an ERP system for 100 users is probably going to run you in the range of $3 to $5 million. So this would allow them to be able to use that, depending on if it's a full replacement, just a minor upgrade or just a tweak. But that kind of, we're talking about, again, serious money.
Follow up?
On that particular one, the software industry, to my distress, has moved to doing subscriptions rather than purchases. And quite frequently, they require that you do it that way. And I understood from her testimony before that they are looking at doing those software upgrades as subscriptions, which would even out the money over the years.
So again, we're talking about whether you purchase or SaaS, software as a service model. But even in a software as a service model, when you make changes to the base model, so you can buy a piece of software. I worked in healthcare information technology, electronic medical record systems. And so when you do a change for a given office, so if OPLC wants a workflow a certain way and they want to modify that workflow, that's not covered under your monthly subscription. It's still going to be an additional cost to do that customized workflow process, which will still be, again, if you're affecting 100 users and 100 different versions, 100 computer systems, that upgrade could be multi-million-dollar upgrade, depending on what the nature of the change is that's outside the out-of-the-box software.
Thank you.
Representative Ames, did I see your hand up?
I think I took it down. Thank you.
Other Representative Fellows.
Yes, Madam Chair. I have a list of questions.
So do I.
So my first question has to do with just the bill. I looked at it and I couldn't, when I tried to figure out like what does the bill currently say now, so take out, the crossouts, I couldn't put together a whole sentence there kind of in the middle of the first paragraph. So I looked back, I went to the RSAs and looked at them, and this bill is not drafted correctly, because the language, like the part shall be used for capital expenditures, like that part of it's not in the current RSA, and unless I'm missing something.
I can actually comment on that a little bit. Just the reason why Representative McGuire, the chairman of eDNA, tabled our bill is because she's working on another big piece of this, which is recodifying everything. So there is going to be some changing RSA numbers. So that's why you may not be seeing it anywhere, because there's other moving parts.
So are you saying that this bill is irrelevant because it's going to show up in another bill?
I believe not. I believe the other bill is going to be more of redesigning the structure of OPLC, and this is more just on the how much money can they hold on
So
to.
my comment is about the drafting, because what I see here, this is not the first section is not that what it currently says in statute. So that's a concern because we can't really vote on it because
Representative Platt has had his hand waving over here, so you're okay with that? Okay, Representative Ullery?
Yeah.
so are you responding to my comment?
Yes. The way, I think some of the confusion is, this bill was modified, and the modifications are the ones that are being shown, not new language. This entire thing could be, and just plain, if it was to replace the entire thing. So whatever language shows up in here is going to go into law, whether it's there now or not.
So anyway, I think
No.
maybe you would need to check on that.
Okay.
I mean, I do understand, and we can, I have questions about the intent, but I think that there's an issue with the drafting.
I would just remind folks that we are the second committee on this, so we are not discussing the underlying policy as much as really focusing on the non-lapsing nature of the fund, the cap on the fund. That's really our focus. Just keep that in mind. Representative
So-
Almy, oh, go ahead.
So, Madam Chair, if I could just, so again, House Bill 655, I think it is, for 355. I can't remember which number is, but that was the OPLC bill that again came out of the commission that Representative Ulrey and I served on from Senate Bill 355, which does a huge modification to OPLC, but not around this topic. So we divided in the study commission, we divided 3 changes that were required. This was one of the 3. Senate Bill, House Bill 355, Representative McGuire's bill, I think it is, was the big policy change, and then there was one other one. I'm drawing a blank on what that one was. So, but there were 3 policy changes. This one, to the chairman's point, this one is specifically about what happens to the lapses and the fact that the lapse should go to serve the people that paid the fee to begin with, and to make sure that we use that to keep the costs as low as possible for the licenses that we issue.
So that was so I told you about my first concern. So my second concern is that from the your testimony, it occurs to me that we wouldn't be having this bill if the fees currently did not give the agency a surplus that was so big as the ones that we're getting, because that current law says they're not supposed to be generating more revenue than 125% of what it costs to operate. So obviously the cumulative fees are too high now. And you and I, since we're both on GELCAR, you may have looked at something that's coming up for the next meeting that had several pages that identified all the different fees for all of them. And clearly to me, in my mind, some were like too high and some were too low. But can you tell me what plans are in the works, and how would the agency go about determining what the accurate, what appropriate fees would be as opposed to what's in there now?
Sure. So understand that OPLC has defense to the commissioner. She's been trying to hit a moving target because the legislature keeps changing it, and she's trying to shoot at it, hit it right. And so I think she's doing the right things. Again, we see that in 2002, the number dramatically reduced, right? It went from 4.1 million in 2001, and then they made some changes and it went down to 2.6 million. So it dropped over $1.5 million.
Do you mean 2021?
From 2021 to 2022, it dropped by $1.5 million surplus reduction because they adjusted and they're doing. So they're trying to correct and not have a dramatic surplus. And so I think they're doing a great job, but again, it's a moving target. We just, like I said, House Bill 355 is going to, or 655, whatever that number is going to dramatically change stuff again for them. But I think they're doing a great job at trying to keep this surplus down. But in the event there is a surplus, that what this bill really says is it's not general fund money to go for all state, for the entire state. It should go back and be used for the purposes of the people who paid those fees in alignment with the Supreme Court decision of 125%, and anything above that is considered a tax and to be unfair tax.
Representative Platt.
Yes, I'm curious, Senator Lang, what's your problem with a cap?
Well, again, I'd like to, I don't work in OPLC, so I don't know what their plans are for the next 10 years as they look at this. And so I'd like to give the commission the opportunity to put a plan together to find out whether or not, just like I said, our schools and towns know we got to replace a roof on a building. And so we may put aside $250,000 a year of undesignated fund balance a year for 5-6 years to pay for a multi-million-dollar roof on a town building or a school, rather than have that all hit in 1 year and jump the local tax rate up. And so I'd like to, my opinion was I trusted the commissioner enough to be able to put a 10-year type plan together and understand what that looks like and manage that fund and do a biannual report. And if the legislature doesn't like what it sees, it can go put a cap on it, but at least give their first opportunity for not having a cap to let her put a plan together.
You still open to more questions?
Sure.
Okay, I don't know how busy you are today. Representative Elberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, just a quick comment about subscriptions. While it may be easier to spread cost over time, the amount you're paying for something is almost invariably significantly higher than if you do an outright purchase. And having gotten that off my chest, I want to look at the other end. What this bill is saying is that there's a recognition that fees are too high or may be too high, and when they are determined to be too high, then the fees would be reduced. I'm wondering about the reverse. If it gets to be a situation where the fees are not covering the costs, is it understood that the fees could be increased? I don't see any language about that in here.
So again, that's a different part of the law. So two things could happen in that case. So in the event that they lowered fees and then they ended up not taking enough revenue in to cover the cost of OPLC, they could also use this fund to supplement that and to make sure that the fund was whole and that we didn't have a deficit in that agency. So it could be used to supplant underperforming licensors. I guess I'm not sure if I understand the second half of your question, the second part of your question. So the question.
If I may, what happens if it gets to a point where there is not enough in the fund to cover costs without increasing fees? Is it understood at that point that while that OPLC has the option to both lower and raise fees?
Thank you for the
to
question.
cover?
So again, in that House Bill 355, 365, 655, whatever that number is, I will say one of the things that we were cleaning up and we learned, what Representative Ulrey and I learned in that committee was that we have conflicting law, and we were trying to look at cleaning it up. We have places where the OPLC director has the right to set licensing fees, and then we also give that same exact right to a board. And the board has a right to set fees. I don't know what happens if we have conflict between those two, but one of the purposes of that House bill was to clean up that conflict in law. So the OPLC director or the board, under current law, already has the right to raise and lower prices. So we don't need to give that. The question is if the price is such that we end up with, for some reason, a giant surplus, what we do with that. We want to make sure it goes back to back to the licensees.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, other questions for Senator Lang, keeping in mind, I have no other pink cards, but we might have an expert in the audience. So, Representative Almy.
Yes, I think I'll reserve most of my questions for that. But we are establishing a new precedent here. We did not have a precedent for 125% for all fees before this time. and we are now creating that. And I had a run-in with the comptroller a year after she arrived in the dedicated fund committee, in which she insisted that since the legislature had put it into law, that we were going to have a set fee for a particular thing that has nothing to do with this agency, that and lapse the rest of it at the end of the year. And they were routinely lapsing 75% of what the fee was to the general fund. That the legislative decision stood, and the 125% that the Finance Committee was using in the budget for a number of purposes was not a general law. So we are making this a law now for OPLC, that they all do that. And then we do run into the problem that there are a couple of agents of groups that are licensed or put into OPLC in earlier days. I think the manufactured housing was put in when we started dedicated
Representative, is there a
funds.
question for the senator?
Yes, and the question is, do you recognize this is going on, and why are we doing this before we get Representative McGuire's complete overhaul of the entire system?
Thank you for your question. And when you did get Representative McGuire's, you voted on it already in the House. It's already in the Senate ED&A committee, so you've already passed it, and it's over in the Senate ED&A, and they're working. If my understanding is, that bill is going to be passed unamended and be done. To answer your other question, there's no conversation here about 125%. Right? You know, that percentage is not anywhere in here. All we're saying is we want to keep license fees for our citizens as low as possible to be able to cover the cost of LPLC, not create a giant surplus. And if we do create a giant surplus, we want it to go back to the citizens who are paying for those fees. That's what this bill is establishing in law.
Thank you. Other questions for the senator? Representative Fellows.
Yeah, this is just technical. I thought I was looking at the RSAs last night, and I thought I saw that 125% in there somewhere.
Well, again,
Yes.
it's just not in this bill. Like,
It's
we're
not
not
in this
establishing
bill,
a
but I
precedent in
think
this
it's
bill. It may be in law
already-
somewhere
is it
else. but-
already in statute, maybe. Can you just tell me about the two bills you've talked about two bills other than this one? One got tabled in the House, and one is now in over in the Senate that are related to this.
Well, what I'll say is it's related in the fact that when we had the committee that to look at OPLC and the issues within OPLC, we came out with 3 recommendations, and I believe I don't remember one of them. I'm drawing a complete blank. I apologize. I didn't prepare for that, for reading back that committee. But Representative Ulrey and I both took this aspect, which was the money, because we knew it was going to go in front of Ways and Means. So we agreed to submit this bill. The other bill was ED&A related relative to the operations of OPLC, and therefore Representative McGuire agreed to take on that bill. That bill, and I apologize, I don't remember the number, but that bill that's currently in the Senate ED&A it's already been voted on by the House, and you've already seen it. It's already been seen and voted on by the House and passed. If I want to say it was passed on consent, but I don't recall.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, well, I had a question.
For the senator, for the OPLC?
I think for the senator, because there is nobody here yet from LBAO to answer this. Why do we have a 0 fiscal note when it is clear that they are going to reduce the lapse to the general fund by $6.5 to $8 million at the end of next year?
As an LBA question, I honestly don't know why on the fiscal note they didn't assign a dollar figure, or maybe the commissioner can answer that question.
Yeah, the commissioner actually is the one that produced the information, so maybe she can.
Thank you for accepting all these questions.
If I had to make a guess, just to say it's because we don't actually reduce any fees or funds. We just change the allocation on where it goes. So the state doesn't see less revenue. It just sees a change in the allocation of the fund.
Thank you very much. I apologize. I'm not sure if, are you a commissioner or a director? Director, welcome. Thank you for filling out a pink card. Thank you for coming up. Could you please introduce yourself for the committee? And if you wouldn't mind, if you can answer any of these questions, that would be helpful.
Certainly. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Lindsay Courtney, I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Office of Professional Licensure and Certification. And I wish to thank Senator Lang for bringing this bill forward. OPLC fully supports this bill. I wanted to start by addressing some of the questions specifically around the OPLC surplus. So the cause of the surplus is really twofold. First, up until last session, over half the practice acts had fees set forth in statute. And as all of you know, we have no ability to change fees that are in statute. Generally, those fees were either $300 or $110. Generally, the $300 fees were way above 125%, and the 110 was a little bit below the 125% mark. We had tried consistently since 2019 to seek legislation to remove those statutory fees. 2019, we sought legislation. 2020, 2021. It wasn't until 2022 that we were successful. Then in 2022, we announced that we were going to start soliciting feedback from our boards and stakeholders as to what the fees should be. It was at that point that a few stakeholders became concerned that OPLC had fee setting authority to begin with, which dated back to 2015, actually, which generated a lot of comments and stakeholder participation. I think it was before Senate Ways and Means. So at that point in time, we were asked by the governor's office to put a pause on modifying our fees. And Representative Fellows, the proposal that you are referencing that's going for jail car does not, with several minor exceptions, does not include any changes to fees that have been in existence for years. So that is one reason why we have a surplus, which is that many of the fees were statutory. Other fees were established by boards for years. Boards themselves are not responsible for paying the bills. And, I would venture to say that many of the fees were to some extent arbitrary. Many of our boards are not covering their costs. I would say that barbering and cosmetology, for example, covers about 40% of their costs. They have not had fee changes, with the exception of one minor fee change last year to raise the cost of their fee by $10. They have not had fee changes in years. And one of the concerns we have in the office is how do you increase fees dramatically because the board neglected to raise fees incrementally over the course of the years. So these are the changes and the issues that we're grappling with as we talk about how to level set the fees for the boards. The number two reason why we have a surplus is because when state revenues are up and things are going well, the state has money to pay for its expenditures. When revenues are not up, state agencies are directed to cut costs. And we were directed to cut costs back in 2019, 2020, 2018, 2019, 2020 in what was called a lapse target, meaning that we lapsed significantly more than we would have liked to cover our operating expenses. The concern I have with the cap is that does not eliminate that possibility from occurring. By virtue of the fact that we would propose to lapse funds to the general fund, we are subject to having directives to essentially cut expenditures so that we can lapse more into the general fund to cover general fund operating expenses. And I would just note that the committee, which was a bipartisan committee, found that surplus fees beyond agency expenditures are lapsed into the general fund. The lapsing of these funds does not serve any purpose for the licensee and only serves to continually drive up fees. The surplus is not the only area where fees are a concern. So we can certainly work within a cap because I think a cap is better than nothing. But the purpose of licensure fees is to fund licensure operations, and that's it. It is not to fund other parts of state government or the general fund, and that is what's happening. The other thing that I wish to mention is that unlike other revenue generating self-funded agencies like liquor and lottery, we are not a revenue generating agency. On July 1, we have no money. On June 30th, the large portion of our renewal cycle ends. And this year, unless we have some statutory change, all of our funds will lapse to the general fund and we will have $0 on July 1. It doesn't mean that we have zero expenses on July 1. So this is another reason why we at least need a buffer. Because our renewal cycles are not consistent. We have major renewal cycles in June of every year and in December. And then throughout the year, we receive initial applications and some renew like nursing and real estate consistently. And it's difficult to project our revenue because some of our revenue is impacted by the market. When the housing is doing really well, we see a huge influx in real estate applications because people want to enter that field. During COVID, we saw a significant increase in the number of healthcare professionals seeking licensure here by endorsement. But it's difficult to project how many licensing applications we will receive and therefore difficult to project revenue. And that's why it does not make sense to have the OPLC operate on, starting with $0 on July 1 of the biennium. I'd be happy to answer any other questions. I'm sure you have some other questions with respect to the fiscal note. That is exactly right. We don't see a change in the amount of monies to the state. It's just a change in where those funds go. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Representative Platt?
I can't resist. For barber and cosmetology, you're going to ask them to take a haircut?
I apologize. Representative Almy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, two things. I hope that we could get Chris Shea to come and talk to us about that fiscal note before we finish this hearing. And he just walked in. And the second is there is on a major question that involves money that apparently is being dealt with, or maybe it's not being dealt with in the bill that is sitting in the Senate now that the Ways and Means Committee didn't see, about the fact that we've got, I don't know how many agencies that are groups that are underfunding their costs. Some of them because the people in them don't get paid very much and can't really afford the higher costs, and others which are paying way too much. And also you mentioned plumbers, someone mentioned plumbers, and I think aren't the plumbers still under safety, or did you manage to grab them?
Yes,
hope
they
you
were
did.
transferred over to us. I wouldn't call it a grab. But yes, they were transferred over to us at the last budget cycle.
Thank you.
Representative Southworth?
Thank you for taking my question. Back to cosmetology. So will passage of this bill help you to address that issue?
So I think what helped us to address that issue, it's really just the large package that was the result of the study committee established by 330. Because although we've had statutory authority and a statutory directive since 2015 to establish fees, we have not had stakeholder consensus. And that's part of the problem with OPLC generally, is that it was created as part of a budget cycle. Nobody wanted us to exist, and that continued to persist for years. And there's still a group of stakeholders that would like to see the board set fees. I think that's largely been worked out by now. And so our initial jail car filing that will hopefully be adopted fairly soon is to just codify all existing fees in one document. And then starting July 1, we are going to be instituting, with the advice of Bureau of Accounts, some time tracking analysis through our New Hampshire First portal so that we can appropriately allocate administrative costs back to the boards and provide a recommendation as to what we need to do to increase fees. To Representative Almey's point regarding whether or not we should be subsidizing certain professions who may or may not make that much money, or our understanding based on the legislation is we don't have statutory authority to do that, and we're not seeking that statutory authority.
Follow up?
Oh,
So these changes are moving you in the right direction?
Yes, certainly, Representative.
Thank you.
Representative Jinigian.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. Just logistically, you said on July 1st, your fund balance goes to zero. So how are you paying bills in July or August for that matter?
Yeah, so we're allowed to pay personnel costs. We're allowed to go in the red for personnel costs. So typically by August, we have enough funds to start covering our regular expenses, if you will. But we don't seek contracts out, typically in the August-September timeframe.
Representative Spilsbury.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The way I read the bill, it essentially creates a four-tier pecking order for the use of funds. Please confirm this if I'm understanding it correctly. So basically, when fees are derived, they go first to paying costs and salaries.
Correct.
And then, as the bill says, any remaining funds shall be used for capital expenditures.
Yes.
And then the bill goes on to say that you can keep up to $3 million, I guess, as a reserve. And then fourth, any funds in excess of the $3 million cap shall be used to reduce licensing and certification fees. And as Senator Lang said, you could deploy those for reductions before you reach the cap, but you must deploy them for reductions once you've reached the cap.
Correct.
Is that all correct?
Yeah.
Could that cap just as well be 1 million?
I think the cap could definitely be 1 million. I think when we talk about OPLC's budget, $1 million is not significant.
Right. After all, it's already not only met the operating costs and salaries, it's also been available for capital expenditures before it even starts to accumulate.
Well, the way I read this is that the capital expenditures could only be up to $3 million because the capital expenditures has to reside somewhere. And so that would have to be in a dedicated account. And I think that's the issue. From our perspective, software, typically the last time the state procured software was in the $3.7 million range. There was a significant amount of funding for development work, and likely we will need to amend that to increase it. But there are other capital expenditures that I think could be in excess of $1 million and $3 million.
So if I can just clarify, you are saying that the allowance for retaining up to 3 million is specifically for the purpose of covering capital expenditures. And I understand capital expenditures, going back to what was raised before, as being essentially those that involve more than the current year, something that is expended or has a life cycle of more than 1 year.
Correct. The way I'm reading this, and I could be wrong, but the way we would interpret it in the office is that we have our operational expenses, which are approved by the House and the Senate, the governor, GNC contracts and the like, and that anything in excess we currently retain in our operating accounts. And we could do that up to $3 million for the purpose of capital expenditures, but anything beyond that we would not be able to retain past the biennium, is how I read that.
Representative Almey.
Thank you. Actually, as I read it, if at the end of the biennium you keep $3 million, you have until the end of the next biennium to spend 6 million. If you had a major software purchase that had to be made or something like that.
I appreciate the reading of that. I don't think we would interpret it to be that way. I mean, I think I think the intent is clear that that anything in excess of 3 million we're supposed to use to reduce licensing fees, something that we support. That said, we can only reduce licensing fees if we're requiring others to actually increase their licensing fees. So the one thing I want to leave this committee with is that there are some professions that are paying well in advance of what they should be paying, and then there are some that are not paying nearly enough. And so that's part of what we're grappling with in the office. But I would read the intent of this legislation, and I think that's consistent with the discussions by the Senate committee, is that we should be reducing licensing fees beyond 3 million.
Follow up?
Are you tackling the question of the groups that are being licensed that include people who are earning very little money? And if you have to increase the cost of the licenses, a lot of them may drop out of whatever it is.
So here are my thoughts on that. Under the 125% analysis, which is presently in statute, each profession or each regulatory board has to support its own costs. Anything above 125% is considered an unconstitutional tax. So essentially, by lowering fees, let's say for a profession, for barbering at 40%, you're asking another profession to subsidize the cost of another profession. Our current statutory framework does not allow that because that would be considered a tax. And so I think it would be up to the legislature to make that determination as to whether certain professions should be subsidizing other professions. But at present, that's not part of our analysis.
Representative Platt.
Yes, I have a serious question this time. When you go into deficit, July and August, how deep a deficit?
I would have to bring those numbers back to you, Representative.
That was aimed at questioning whether 3 million was enough, too much, whatever.
I think 3 million is certainly enough to cover any sort of deficit in July and August.
I would just remind the committee that we've already done the House bill on this, and we voted for it when we decided on the 3 million cap. Just a
I
reminder.
understand, but I'm not sure what basis we had for the 3 million, and so I was going at basis.
Yeah, and that's because it was the typical average, and we should have notes on that. Other questions? Yes, Representative Ors.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for taking my question. So I missed the number. The last time you did a major computer upgrade, what was the cost?
It was 3.7, and that was a statewide enterprise solution. So it's a DOIT contract. It wouldn't be under the office. But what we're already discovering through our internal controls project is that many of the boards have obligations to license professions that they have not necessarily been enforcing. And so we have to increase the number of licensed professions within that contract. And so 3.7 is likely the ceiling.
And what year was that?
That was just last year.
Okay, thank
And
you.
we likely will go out to bid for the procurement of the next contract within the next year or two.
Other questions? Representative Ames has his up.
Yeah, just an easy one. And maybe it's been answered, but the Senate, the bill that's now in the Senate, do you have the number for that?
Yes, it's House Bill 655. It's currently before Senate Finance. 655.
Thank you.
Representative Fellows.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm interested in how to get the fees back in line with where they should be. So I know the 125% is somewhere in statute. And I know it has something to do with a court ruling is that correct?
Well, the court did rule that, yes, correct. I'm not sure that the statute is based on the court ruling or vice versa, but it applies to all boards, whether it be in a court ruling or statute.
So the requirement for 125% is per board? Or is it per all of OPLC?
You raise an interesting point. I understand it to be per board. I think we would see I think stakeholders would be concerned if the interpretation were that it only applies to the agency. There continues to be, a lack of consensus as to what OPLC should be able to control versus what the boards. And I think the feedback that we've gotten from a lot of boards and from the legislature and from stakeholders is that the fees of our particular profession should be used only for that profession and not for other professions.
But follow up.
Follow up.
So, but what you're telling me is what the public wants. It's not because of the court ruling. I'm just trying to figure out how.
No,
to
what
get-
I'm saying is the existing statute requires that each profession support itself.
So profession. So that means you have a board, the cosmetology and the barbers and whatever, they're all multiple professions are in one board.
I'm using the term profession loosely. I apologize, Representative. Each board is required to support itself. And within each board, they have multiple professions and they can choose whether they would like to subsidize certain license types or others. And for example, nursing has chosen to subsidize LNAs and charge APRNs and RNs more. That is their choice. But what is improper, at least our interpretation with the advice of DOJ under the statute, is to say pharmacies, which pay $2,000 if they're a mail order pharmacy, have to cover the cost of LNAs because those are two different boards.
Representative Almond,
So
did you
just
have another
just to clarify?
one final follow up? Thank you.
Well, so DOJ told you it's okay for pharmacies to cover some of the costs for LNAs?
No, that's the opposite of
Oh.
what I said. DOJ has advised that each board has to cover its own costs based on their interpretation of the statute, and we agree with that interpretation. So we cannot require that pharmacy, for example, just an example,
Oh, that's-
subsidize other professions like LNAs.
And just as the last part of this is this process for determining what the fees should be for each profession or, within the board, are there rules related to that?
So this has been a long-standing project. There's a statute that requires us to seek stakeholder and board feedback. We began this process back in 2021. That's what led to a modification of Senate Bill 330 actually, and created a committee to study the issue because there was stakeholder feedback. And then we decided first, rather than having rules in 54 different sets of rules, that we would take the existing statutory and regulatory fees and put them in one document. That is currently before JAILCAR, and there's, with few minor exceptions, very few modifications to fees. And then the next step is going to be changing the how we cover or how we assess our time in the office, and then redo the allocation of shared costs so that we can provide boards with their total costs, operating costs for the biennium, so that then we can propose new fees. And we likely will have to do that fairly soon over the course of a 6-month period in order to make sure that all boards are covering their costs and other boards are not paying way too much.
Representative Almy?
Yes, two things. What court judgment? Is this new?
No, it was a Supreme Court case.
30, 40 years ago?
Yes. And I forget the
The
name.
same one that we've been operating under.
Correct, Representative.
Which- Yes. And then the other one is, they're under the, HB 655. Are you given authority to, deconstruct some of the boards under your purview?
What do you mean by deconstruct?
Well, end.
Oh,
Delete.
no. Oh, no, we wouldn't, no, that has not been proposed. What was proposed in HB2 was to eliminate certain boards. I think that was largely taken out, but there's nothing in 655 that would propose to repeal statutes establishing boards.
Thank you.
Other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you
Thank
very
you for your
much.
time. Appreciate
And
it.
I would remind folks to just look back at your notes from the last bill that we dealt with. It was very, very similar to this as we go forward. Okay. Any other, Representative Almy?
Could we ask Chris Shea to come and explain the fiscal note to us?
I don't know if he's
He doesn't
prepared
have
to
a
do that.
background of what we were talking about before you showed up, but
Chris, I don't know if you're aware, we're on Senate Bill 49.
right. And it is quite clear that the lapse to the general fund at the end of next year will disappear, and it's 6.5 to $8 million estimate. On why is the fiscal note 00000?
Thank you for the question. For the record, Chris Shea, Legislative Budget Assistant, the Deputy for the Office. The total revenue being collected isn't changing as a result of this bill. It's just where the revenue is being deposited. So now it's going to all remain within the dedicated OPLC fund. And that's why in the narrative, we explained that the general fund wouldn't get a piece of the revenue that it was getting under the current law, but the total revenue doesn't change. So that's why it's zeroed at the top. If we put a negative number there, it would look like there's revenue being lost. But we're trying to explain, because of the table's limitations, that it's general funds and other funds that are being impacted. And then in the narrative, we explain what happens. So that's the only reason. It's a net zero impact for the revenue collected by the state.
Are you open to other questions? Representative Fellows.
Oh,
Thank you, Madam
I
Chair.
had a follow-up.
I apologize. Would you yield for
Could
Representative
you-
Almy?
Thank you. So if under this bill, it's 8 million that should have lapsed, 2 million will lapse because there's a 3 million, no, the 3 million is the biennium. So 5 million would lapse?
Based on the language in the bill, I believe none lapses back to the general fund at this point.
So they'd have to,
There's limitations on what they can have in the fund, and there's ways that the OPLC is expected to expend that revenue.
so they'll have to expend up to $5 million in the next year.
Or reduce licensing and certification fees.
Right, well, that's part of expending. This doesn't seem to be terribly helpful when you're dealing with what's in the general fund.
The fiscal note does have some
the fiscal note.
limitations when there's a net zero impact on a funding or an expense. And that's why the narrative aspect of it becomes a little bit more important.
Yeah, and something that a lot of people don't read.
I can't help that if they don't read the narrative part. It's there to help you.
Representative Fellows.
Thank you. I have a question about capital expenditures, because this bill talks about money being available to the agency for capital expenditures after they pay for their operating expenditures. So what is the process for spending capital expenditures? Can you give us a definition of what it means when, as in this bill, and what is the process for approving an expenditure? Can it be done by the agency? Does it have to be budgeted? Does it have to go to the capital, whatever, the committee?
Thank you for the question. This fund is non-lapsing and continually appropriated to the OPLC. And within that language, they're allowed to spend the money in certain ways. And so the OPLC would potentially be able to spend the money on a capital project without needing to come back through the capital budget process or come back to fiscal or finance. because the authority is given to them to spend from the fund. For those members who've been around for a while, you may recall back probably 8 years ago, when this dedicated fund was starting, a previous director wanted to use some of the fund to pave the parking lot at their old site, and there were some questions on whether that was allowable. So I don't know if that's part of the reason for getting this capital expenditure. I heard the director mention that they had computer projects that they would want to expend funds on and are expending funds on. But the way
And-
this is structured, they would have that ability to do
And
so.
can you define the capital? What qualifies as capital?
I think it's typically thought of as like the structures, and more recently, it's you start to include your larger IT projects. You know, so if there's a new system being put in, that's been considered a capital expense, at least in the capital budget. But I would defer to OPLC to give you a better definition of what they anticipate the term capital expenditures might mean here.
Representative Almy, and then we'll go over there.
Thank you. So would you, would they be allowed to, if they could find or build another place to move into that is slightly less expensive than the one they're stuck in now for 8 years, to spend money to break the lease and to move without having to go through capital budget?
So purchasing buildings is a function of administrative services. So I think that there would be other processes in place if the OPLC were to want to move and break its lease and move into a new facility. I think there would be some other oversights around that.
Representative Spilsbury.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Taking your point about it's a wash and the limitations of the fiscal note, isn't it nevertheless pretty much the bottom line that if the fund could be generating as much as $8 million over the biennium, and that no longer defaults to the general fund, and they are required by this bill to adjust fees downwards as soon as they hit the $3 million threshold, the end result is this drives a process that reduces the fees by about $5 million.
I think timing becomes an issue. So if you look at our fiscal note, it goes through 26. So depending on when this might occur, it might be outside that period. So I don't think we would speculate at this point how much extra revenue they would or wouldn't have to drive down fees. That's relatively new to this version of the bill.
Representative Leapley.
Thank you. I know we talked about this bill, and I know I'm new, so some of my questions might be repeats. So to follow up on Representative Spilsbury's question, fiscal notes are only looking at a biennium or a year?
They look at the current year you're in and then 3 years out.
Okay. Because it does seem like the way this is constructed, like by design, it reduces revenue. Like that's part of the reason it's written. So it does seem strange that that idea cannot be captured in the fiscal note design that we currently have. So that might be problematic.
Thank you for the comment. We look at our fiscal note every year and try to come up with ways to address all different aspects that we run into. It's very difficult to make every situation fit this framework. We try to standardize it so that it's known and understood. So any potential comments, we receive that and we'll try to come up with some solutions, and it may take us a little bit, but agreed. I mean, it would be better to have a deeper analysis on this maybe than what's on there currently. But we do have some limitations on how we can get that done.
Thank you. It's great
Yep.
to learn that this is something that you do sometimes tweak when you have new information. So thanks for sharing that. The other question I have, and I know we
Follow up?
discussed, thank you. I know we discussed this bill before. So I'm sorry to ask the question again, but if we have an IT department and if we have the capital budget process, I guess I'm wondering why a department needs its own capital budget.
I would defer the question to the OPLC.
Okay, so I guess I'm wondering if department wide, it seems odd. It's not every single department has its own capital budget and its own IT budget. Normally those function through a different process. So thank you for the question. I'm learning.
We all are learning every day. That's why we keep coming back. Representative Fellows.
So just to follow up on that, can you tell us, like, are there other agencies who have this kind of structure where they have non-lapsing fund and they can buy a new building without getting any legislative approval of that?
I don't know of any agency that has a dedicated fund where they could buy a building. Agencies, there are a number of dedicated funds that are continually appropriated and non-lapsing to an entity, either be a department or a commission or a function, and that those funds can be used based on what the statute says it can be used for. So in this case, the statute's including capital expenditures. There may be examples of that. I'm not aware of it off the top of my head.
Representative Almy.
There was the Department of Safety when they needed to replace the building that was falling into the Winnipesaukee.
You're referencing the E911? Yeah.
This was back before that. This was during the Great Recession.
I think it was the second building it was the backup building for E911. No? Oh, Marine Patrol. I'd have to see how that project came about. Yeah. Yeah.
Fallen in when we decided to keep the money in the dedicated fund.
Okay, other questions? Seeing none, thank you for coming up on this bill. I do not.
I have just one little one.
One
just
little one.
tiny.
Representative Fellows.
So just in terms of money not being available at the beginning of the year to cover costs of an agency, my understanding is that if they have an appropriation, it's not important that they don't have any cash right at the beginning of the year. Is that true, or does it apply to OPLC?
So agencies that are funded with other funds or a dedicated fund, because of cash flow, they may go into a red or into a negative at the start of a fiscal year, but it's anticipated based on projections that they're going to earn enough revenue. It'll get caught up that Comptroller's Office and Bureau of Accounts would track that and as they earn revenue, repay back the general fund for paying any costs up front.
So covering the payroll is not a problem. Does not become an issue.
People will be paid.
Thank you very much. Senator Lang, did you have one more thing to add? Okay, great. Come on up, and then we'll close this. Unless if there's anyone else who's here for Senate Bill 49, please fill out a pink card for us now.
So the only thing I wanted to remind the committee is that the commissioner doesn't have the authority to expend money on a capital expenditure without going in front of the governor and council. So any contract that was above $5,000 that they would seek. So the software upgrade she was talking about, that would be potentially a $3.7 million. There was $3 million in her account. They just can't go do it without seeking approval from another body. So I just want to make sure it was clear that doesn't give her a $3 million check to write whenever she wants, that contract would still have to go in front of the governor and council and go through that process through those elected officials.
One more question. Are you open to that, Representative?
Yeah, just related to that, it goes to governor and council after the agency has done an RFP, and so the governor and council is saying, is this an above board contract, or if they put it out to bid, were the procedures fair and were they evaluated correctly, and they, dot all the I's and cross all the T's in terms of contracts. But isn't it correct that governor and council doesn't decide that the agency gets to purchase something. They just look at the contract to make sure the contract is good, correct?
So I guess I say that's not true. Again, the governor would bring, it would have to be put on the agenda. So the governor has to approve to say that they want this to go forward and put it on the council agenda. So by tacit approval, the governor would have to say that it's a worthwhile project and goes in front of the executive council. Just because an agency gets an RFP for something that nobody wants to do doesn't mean it's forced to go in front of the executive council. So again, there's tacit approval by the executive council and the governor that not only is the contract process fair and was appropriate, but also is that the project's needed.
Yes.
You may want to bring the director up just to talk about that process a little bit. She would be much more familiar with that than myself and probably Senator Lang.
Would
The director of
He-
OPLC would be
oh,
able to talk about the governor and council process
with
in much more detail
executive
than we would.
council? She knows more about the executive council?
Yeah, the
process?
executive agencies tend to meet with the executive council much more
Okay.
frequently.
Okay, why don't, I think there's a lot more questions that some members have, and I certainly encourage you to go to the director or whoever you need to, any board member, the senator, do your own research on this. Take the time. We're not going to execute today. And take your time on that because we do have some presentations coming up, and I want to make sure we don't eat into that time too much. Okay? Okay, great. Thank you so much. And with that, we'll close the public hearing on Senate Bill 49. And we will take a 5-minute recess, and we will come back and we will listen to presentations on revenue updates. So again, make sure you get the director's direct contact information. If you have more detailed questions, she can help you. Okay, let's get started so we don't go too into lunch time. So as I think we've all seen reported in the press, the Senate found $184 million more than we found in incoming revenue. And so now we're very curious where that is. So we're very pleased to have the Commission of the DRA and Chris Shea back to give us an update.
Yeah, good morning. For the record, Chris Shea, Deputy LBA. Before you, you have 4 documents. You have the DRA document that's probably familiar to most of you. You have a single page long sheet. It's got 2 giant tables on it. Then you have a long page, which is just the difference between the House and the Senate. And then there's a compare sheet. And then the last thing is a worksheet. That, again, it's familiar. The House has used this type of format. So those are the 4 documents you have before you. The first document I want to start with is the 1 sheet long. And what this document is the DRA information, the range of estimates that they provided to the House. That's on the left side. And then the range of estimates that they provided to the Senate, which is on the right side. And to the chair's comment that the Senate found about $184 million more in revenue, the reason for that is in your business taxes, your meals and rentals tax, your interest and dividends tax. The base number that the Senate had to use was higher than what the House had. So that they started at a higher point than what the House did when they were doing their estimates. And if you look at the shaded pieces, you'll see that the ranges that the department grew the bases are the same. So for instance, under the business taxes, row 5, they grew the base from 0% to 2% each year. That was the same growth that they provided to the Senate. And you'll see that throughout. The one place that there are some adjustments would be in the tax law changes. So because you have collected revenue through April, for the Senate side, the department was able to make some adjustments to say that we've accounted for some of those decreases in revenue. So going forward, for instance, on line 6, instead of 19.6 in fiscal year 2023 for your business tax, for the tax law change, it was 17.1 decrease. So I just again wanted to put this in front of you just so you could see what your ranges were for those taxes that the DRA collects, and then what the ranges were for the Senate. And again, that's really how most of this growth occurred. Because if
Could you just explain what tax law change reduced the business profits tax number?
So you had House Bill 2 from 2021, House Bill 2 credit carryover from 2021. So these are all things that over the 3 years that would have impacted your revenues. Again, 2022, you had House Bill 1221, which was a rate change. And then the apportionment for the NOL and Senate Bill 435 in 2022 were all related to the business taxes. And for each of those, DRA made an adjustment. And I'll let Lindsay speak to that if you'd like.
Good morning, Lindsay Stepp, Commissioner, New Hampshire Department of Revenue. The change that results from the 19.6 in fiscal year 23 that we gave you in the House when you were doing your business tax estimates compared to the 17.1 million that we gave to the Senate. That is solely due to the HB2 credit carryover cap. We started to see some refunds issued as a result of that cap in the time period between when we gave you your estimates and when we did the Senate estimates.
Thank you.
So I guess for the committee's purposes, I'd move you to the long sheet that's multiple pages long and just kind of walk you through each of the taxes on the front page, or each of the revenues on the front page, and where the adjustments are different. So the long sheet starts with the House and Senate Ways and Means General Fund Education Trust Fund estimates. the left side of the sheet, you have the plan number and then the House passed revenue. The middle of the sheet, you see the Senate Ways and Means estimates, and then the last three columns are the differences between the Senate Ways and Means estimates and the House estimates. Right away, you can, if you go across the bolded business taxes, you can see that the Senate was $25 million higher in fiscal 23, $47 million higher in 24, and $41 million higher in 25. This is the bulk of the increase that we're talking about. And again, it has to do with the Senate had the advantage of having the April and March revenues collected. DRA was able to do some work related to that and came up with some new analyses on what they thought the revenues might be over the next couple of years, which created a higher base to start from. In terms of projections from that base, the Senate was within the same areas or ranges as the House. You know, it wasn't like the Senate said, okay, we're going to grow it by 10%. And in fact, in some instances, the Senate grew their base number a little bit less than the percentage growth that the House used when they grew their base. Similar thing for Meals and Rooms. As you recall with Meals and Rooms, it's on a gross number. Then you reduce it by the amount that's going to be transferred to the Municipal Revenue Fund, and that gives you the net number that would go to the general fund. It just happened that for the Senate in fiscal year 23 and 24, the number is 320.6, but their gross number was slightly higher in the second year, but there was more removed for the Municipal Revenue Fund. Tobacco and liquor, there were no, tobacco, there was a slight change in 25. The Senate was just under $1 million higher. There was some discussion that some members didn't believe that it would reduce as steeply as the House had reduced it. But again, it was within less than $1 million. But other than that, fiscal 23 and 24 were the same. Liquor, there was no change from what the agency provided to the Senate or the House. The I&D is a $10 million increase in all 3 years. Again, that has to do with the base. And if you look at the long sheet, the Senate essentially took the, what was I going to say? Sorry. They went with the low end of the range that they had on their sheet. So it was 145 million. That's what they stuck with. And then they just grew it by the 10 million or reduced it by 10 million. So it was exactly 10 million higher than the House position. Insurance tax. So premiums were collected in April, or excuse me, in March, and then adjustments are made in April. After all that had been done, the department came in and said they were $15.3 million higher than what they anticipated when they were before the House. So you'll see in 23, you see that adjustment up. For 24 and 25, the reason that there's a slight difference is that the Senate questioned the commissioner of Department of Insurance and said, you were pretty conservative with your numbers. Why couldn't we go up slightly in 24 and 25? And there was an agreement to go up by the $1 million each year. The agency felt that was reasonable. Communication services tax. Again, the base changed slightly, so you'll see some of the growth that the Senate had over the House. They did hold it flat, almost flat all 3 years. It was 30.3 in 23, and then 30 million and 30 million in 24, 25. If you need to jump in at any point, feel free. Okay.
Shall I ask the question now or when we're done?
Oh, sure. Would you be open to a question now? Yeah, sure. Representative Schamberg?
On the insurance that the Senate said they just requested, was that backed up by any economic factors by the insurance department?
So the insurance department, testified that they tend to use a conservative approach to estimating their revenues. So they were questioned as to why couldn't it be a little bit higher? If you're being conservative, why not be a little bit higher? And they agreed that it could be slightly higher. So if we're moving down to the real estate transfer, you'll see it's a decrease from the House position. Again, the base was lower for the real estate transfer in 23 than it was for the House.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Representative Southworth.
Yes, for Stratford County, our Register of Deeds has warned us that really was a rough period. Fortunately, we found some ways to make up the funds, but there was a pretty large hit just for our county.
You're talking on real estate transfer taxes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're seeing that statewide, basically.
And you'll see the Senate had a, $13.5 million less than the House, and then 5 and 5 and 24, 25, reflecting some of what they heard in their hearings on the revenue. Court fines and fees, you'll see a slight adjustment down. The agency, many of you know Donna Raymond from the courts. She relooked at her figures and came in slightly less than what she had presented to the House. So you'll see it's a $200,000 adjustment down in 23, 500,000 in 24, and 800,000 in 25. And much of that has to do with some of the plea by mail related revenue. And I think she testified to that before you, that it's really hard to project where that's going to land, because there's been changes on who collects that, but also with COVID and what the courts were doing, some of the flow of that revenue. Securities revenue, there was no difference between what the House and the Senate had. No difference in the beer tax. The other revenue, you'll see a slight adjustment upward in 23. So now that they, again, are through the month of April, the department comptroller and then the treasurer had a better sense of where we were going to land with some of those other revenues, including interest revenue and the abandoned property revenue. So they were up by 2.3 over the House, but slightly down in 24 and 25, 100,000 each year. Again, it's just based on their forecasting of some of those revenues. The lottery revenue, you're going to see it was up in 23. The House had 170 million, 0.8. The commission came in at 180 million for 23. Similar to insurance, the director of the Lottery Commission indicated that they budget their revenue pretty conservatively. So the committee challenged them to maybe increase it slightly. And the commission agreed with the CFO after looking at some of his projections, agreed it could go up by 2 million in 24 and 1 million in 25.
Representative Southworth.
Thank you. In talking with the lottery, the different forms of gambling, we've been hearing room for growth in our conversations, but it doesn't look like the budget really showed room for growth. Is that just unknown?
So if you recall, when the director for the Lottery Commission spoke with you, he talks about a lot of unknowns with the revenues associated. You need a couple of big Powerball type games, and that the $1 billion lottery or prize is becoming old. People want to see something higher. So the revenue generation is slowing down slightly. In addition, you've got other games that are opening up, and he still hadn't fully realized the benefits or the impacts on each other. So he had talked about a conservative approach to his revenues in the out years. I think the Senate pushed him a little bit more than the House did on that aspect of being conservative in the 2 out years.
Representative Leapley.
I turned it off instead of on. I apologize. Sorry. So just to restate, to make sure I understand this correctly, it sounds like the Senate, based on the first quarter revenues of this year, for FY 2023, pushed up their estimates. Is that correct?
So you have 9 months of revenue collected through April, and based on what you've collected.
Right. So it's not just the first quarter.
Correct.
It's actually 9 months.
It's 9 months. So you have a good, and some of your revenue collections, you see most of that occur in April, like
Right.
your I&D. So based on some of these estimates that came in, the Senate had a better position in terms of their projections than the House did. If you recall, the House, you didn't really have March estimates or April estimates done.
Right. So they're estimating 2023 really with only 3 months left.
Right.
Okay. And then 2024, 2025 numbers look lower because, like us, they're expecting the economy to slow down a little bit from 23.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Representative Platt.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for taking my question. When did the Senate pass its revenue estimate? How long ago?
Last Wednesday.
Okay, so there's no updates from DRA to have us further tweak, and thank you.
No, but DRA is here to, if there was questions that were beyond me, which wouldn't take much.
Yeah, and again, the House is always at a little bit of a disadvantage because the two major revenue months are March and April, and we didn't have that information. So, but thank you. Representative Ames.
Thank you, and thank you for being here and helping us out. I'm looking at the business tax and the net revenue and the amounts projected by the Senate Ways and Means, and essentially they're sort of halfway between your high and low, as I get it. I mean, that's rough, but something like that. My question is to you, to DRA, and whether, since you met with us, because these are still the same, it's the same spread factors that you used before, whether a lot has happened in the economy in the last 2 months, or appears to have happened, or, we're all looking at it and wondering what's going on. And predictions are, as usual, impossible to make, but we make them nonetheless. And so you're hanging in there with 0% and 2%, in both years. Can you just... Sorry, I just fiddle with my hands and yeah.
Sure, the factors that go into the 0 to 2% range. So I will counter your statement of a lot has happened in the economy in the last few months to a lot of conversations about the economy have happened in the last few months. Although looking at our business tax revenues, we're not seeing a lot of changes necessarily in the economy. Estimates for April were 23% ahead of the prior April. Returns and extensions performed well, up about 5% from the prior year. And our tax notice revenue is still strong. So I think those factors are kind of leading us to that 2%, where we're still seeing strong revenues in the business taxes, but it is those conversations about the economy, I think, that are causing us to lower that growth to that essentially stagnant growth at 0%. And the things that we're thinking about there are inflation. It seems to be calming down a little bit. And so it's not climbing at the same rate that it had in the prior year. We are keeping an eye on employment numbers. Employment is still strong. And the expectations coming out of the Employment Security Department are that we're still doing quite well in terms of employment. When that number starts to grow is when we kind of we'll start to get a little bit more nervous about where the economy is heading. I think, though, at this point, the biggest unknown is the debt ceiling and what is going to happen there. If nothing happens there, these numbers would look very different. But that is an unknown and something that we can't really factor in at this point, but is something that we're watching. So the 0 to 2%, like I said, is really the result of our revenue numbers still look really strong. But we know that there are at least some cooling factors in the economy and that we shouldn't expect the continued growth that we've seen. And what we're feeling is a reduction in the growth, but not necessarily a turn negative. And so that's why the bottom is at 0.
Representative Almy.
Thank you. we have two factors coming into play starting in 24. Credit carry forward, you mentioned, there's some changes, initial changes in it, and what were they?
So those were the same for fiscal 24. The Senate estimates used the same numbers that you had, which was we're anticipating a $13.5 million reduction in revenues due to the CCO cap in 24 and a 3.8 million reduction in 25. Those numbers didn't change from the House to the Senate.
They did.
No, what I said changed was fiscal 23 impact, because we have started to see some refunds in fiscal 23. So the number no, that's fine. The number that the House was given in fiscal 23 for the impact of CCOs was 11 million. And when we presented to the Senate, we reduced that number to 8.5 million because we had seen some refunds starting to happen. So it was only for fiscal 23 that we modified that number for the Senate.
So you don't, one of the fears is that if we head towards recession, that more people are going to upfront their taking back what they've got in the Treasury. And you haven't seen any discussion even of that yet.
We have not, and that decision is really a business by business decision. Some will choose to bring the cash back because they want the cash back in their own accounts. Others, when the economy is looking like it is heading into some sort of a slowdown or a recession, they will leave their CCO with us to make sure that they have enough money with us to make their payments and not incur additional penalties and interest. So it really is a business by business decision.
Okay, and could I, the second factor on the single sales factor, we are losing a number of very large businesses that sell outside the state, produce and sell outside the state. Do you feel fairly confident that we're going to be able to replace those with companies that we haven't yet had much or any from, that are going to be selling inside our elderly state?
The short answer to that question is yes. I don't feel like businesses moving out of the state or only selling outside of the state will not be at least mostly made up by sales into the state, for which we didn't count or get as much apportionment from previously. So we cannot fully analyze that because that change is still relatively new. But again, the revenue numbers look strong. So I'm not seeing it causing a drastic impact at this point on our revenues.
Representative Spilsbury.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two questions, if I may. Okay.
Work session, so it's a little more fluid for questions. Thank you.
So the difference in timing of the House review and the Senate view is clear, and the fact that March and April revenues continued to exceed, particularly on the business and M&R, that's all clear. So I don't find that at all surprising that it's reflected in FY23. I guess following further on Representative Ames' line of inquiry, what would give us hope that a recession isn't virtually inevitable, given the Fed's policy to break things down? And why would we, even if we're seeing stronger revenues in 23 as we close out the final months, why would we expect that to be repeated in 24 and 25?
So the Fed's policy has been in place for quite a while now. They've been raising interest rates consistently for over a year. And we haven't seen that yet result in a recession. I think a lot of people expected that we would have seen a recession by now, and we haven't. So there is a part of me that hopes and believes that the Fed is being at least somewhat successful in cooling the economy without sending us into a recession. I think what makes this a little bit different than prior instances of raising of interest rates is that there is a fair amount of money still in the economy as a result of the federal government infusion of revenue during COVID. And so that may be helping to bolster what would have otherwise caused a recession as a result of the interest rates going up. Business taxes fiscal year to date through April were through April, we're 5.5% ahead of prior year. So I don't anticipate that growth to continue, which is how we kind of get to the 0 to 2. I believe when the House did their estimates, you had a slightly negative growth before the tax law changes, and then the Senate took a 1% growth, took the middle of our range for 23 to 24.
So just to further on the first question, yeah, I think that's an outstanding explanation.
Hopefully it's right.
And I accept that anything that we try to project is just purely speculative. But I'm less optimistic because I do think that it's the stated intention of the Fed to, yes, they've been trying for a year to get a reaction and they haven't gotten it. So they're basically saying, we're going to keep doing this until something breaks.
Sure.
That's my, just to close out that first. Second question, I see in the entries at the bottom of the page, the changes to current law. The biggest item there is the acceleration of the IND repeal. And since there's no action yet by the Senate, that magnifies the difference in FY25. But I'm just wondering, status, since I haven't been following where the Senate's at, if they've just adopted these revenue estimates last Wednesday, where are they at with the budget bill, and are there tax law or tax rate changes that are likely to come forward in the Senate budget bill?
So currently, the Finance Committee, Senate Finance Committee, is in the process of making some decisions. They'll complete decisions potentially by next Friday or the following Tuesday. They still have some outstanding issues that they're discussing and still debating. So there's not much I can say at this point. There has been no action taken on the IND aspect yet.
Fair enough. Then would it be correct to say that the Senate's actions, such as they may turn out to be, are not yet reflected in this chart and may close that apparent gap a bit?
That's correct.
All right, I had some hands up over here.
So,
First, Representative Fellows. Oh,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
if I could just, so really what you want to focus on is the top part of that. I put the bottom part on there just to remind you what the House did. So as we move forward through the Senate phase, if you're paying attention, you'll say, oh, they did the same thing or they didn't. And then you can make some adjustments for yourself.
Representative Fellows.
So it's kind of on the same topic. So I just wanted more clarification on those changes to current law, or are they proposed changes to current law? And then I see that there's something that doesn't have anything to do with total revenue, but for the education, between the general fund and the education trust fund, that some of the BET money was being moved out of the general fund
Right.
into the trust fund. And what, can
So-
you explain what that was?
So currently it is proposed, it's the House position, it's the House proposed changes to current law that you're seeing reflected there. Those changes are shown on the surplus statement. As you recall, when I came before you earlier this season, any current law changes would be reflected on the surplus statement. I carry them here just so that you can see an apples to apples once all decisions are made. Because this is the general fund, education, trust fund combined, you don't see the difference on where BPT, BET is going for the education, trust fund, or general fund. That'll be shown on the next 2 pages. So I haven't gotten there yet, but there's a piece in House Bill 2 that would change how the business taxes are allocated to the education trust fund and the general fund.
Okay, so that switch is in the House version of HB 2.
That is correct.
Okay, and these are all things that were in the House version because Senate, we
Yes.
don't have the HB 2. Is
That's
that
correct.
Okay.
They
thanks.
haven't finished that work yet.
Representative Platt.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my question. I share some of Representative Spilsbury's concerns. We haven't hit a recession yet. But it's the last inflation, monthly inflation rate was 5.5%, somewhere in that range, well above the 2% target that the feds, and I don't buy the 2%, I'd make it 0, but they have a 2% upper limit target. So they're going to continue to raise interest rates, maybe at a slower pace because of the impact on banking. But as they do that, it's eventually going to have an impact, one would think. It may be delayed because of the federal money sloshing around from all the federal stimuli, but that's drying up. So do you share that sentiment, or you think are more optimistic than I am?
No, I do share that sentiment. And so I think what it comes down to is, does that impact on interest rates and hopefully lowering inflation cool the growth or result in negative growth? And what we believe at this point is that it's going to cool that growth from the 5.5%, almost 6% that we're seeing now. The growth over the prior year was at 6%. So we have seen a little bit of a cooling of that growth. I think that will continue and it will accelerate. It will, that we went from 6% year over year growth. We're currently at 5.5% year over year growth. I very much think that will cool, hence the 0 to 2%. We are just at this point not predicting that it will go negative. And we could be wrong. But and to your point though, the timing of, potential federal monies drying up, the timing of when, if and when we see really employment issues in all sectors. Employment issues at the moment tend to be in certain industries. You hear of, tech layoffs, but then you hear of other industries that, will hire anybody because they need bodies. When that employment issue starts to become more
Even me?
when that employment issue starts to become, if and when that becomes more broad-based, or the impacts to industries become more broad-based, and we see the impacts affecting every business, that's when I think we might go negative. And again, as we've talked about previously, New Hampshire doesn't tend to, our revenues in a recession do not fall as far as other states. We don't see, a drastic decrease in revenues. We don't fall as far, but we take longer to recover. So think of like the Nike swoosh, right? It's a little bit of a drop and then a longer recovery. So I think that historical perspective is factoring into our estimates as well.
Representative Almy.
At NCSL, I think 4 years ago, and I haven't been able to follow it up since. There was a very good analyst who mentioned in response to a question of mine that the feds are once a year take a survey of all of the bank accounts in America, and they in the spring, as I recall, but you don't get the results until the fall.
Okay.
And they analyze it by income level. I don't know if they recall if they also do it by industrial sector or whatever. That would be harder because they're mixing up all of the accounts, not just the individual accounts. And I wonder if we could get a copy of last year's and the year before, even knowing what it had been moving between 21 and 22 would be some kind of help. One of my theories and his actually was that the money would die out of the accounts of lower income people first and then gradually come up to a level where you were talking people with real money or corporations with real money.
Sure. We both took a note of that. So between the two of us, hopefully we can track down that information for you.
Oh, Representative Janian.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with the idea that the Fed is going to continue raising to get to 2%. We don't know where that's going to land. But this morning and previous to this morning, I've read articles about how there's a continuing credit crunch that's starting to grow, where people are. The other thing that's possibly leveling this out right now is people using their credit cards. And with credit card balances continuing to increase, at some point they can't increase anymore. And so the multiple factors of the Fed stated goal of continuing to raise rates until they hit 2% inflation, coupled with the credit card crunch that seems to be increasing, would you agree that that could also cause a slowdown?
I do agree. And the other tax type to consider with that is the meals and rentals tax, because that's how do you pay when you go out to dinner at a restaurant, right? Most people pay with your credit card. How do you pay for hotel stays, credit cards? So that is another tax that we would keep an eye on with respect to that specific issue.
Follow-up?
Not completely a follow-up, but an additional concern for the economy is that I, as a landlord, over the past couple of years have raised my rents because of increasing costs. But one of the things I'm seeing is tenants are starting to max out on what they can afford. That doesn't stop the cost side for me to keep increasing, but I can't necessarily increase the rents anymore. So eventually that's another factor, and not just landlords, but any sort of store that's raising rates, raising prices. At some point, the consumer just can't afford it anymore.
Agreed. I think we talked a little bit about that in this committee as well when you were doing your meals and rentals estimates, right? Inflation's going to drive prices up, costs are going to increase, restaurants are going to increase prices, which increases the tax, since the tax is a function of the price, until the point where either restaurants can't increase the price anymore because consumers just won't pay it. The supply and demand doesn't work.
So effectively that could decrease M&R taxes coming in and business profits tax.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
Question?
Yes, Representative Schamberg or no, Southworth.
Thank you. It may be partly propaganda, but there have been several articles from people in that industry saying that their bookings are way up and they're expecting one of the biggest summers in many, many years, especially from people coming from Canada and so on. So I know there's a lot of information. It does seem kind of contradictory.
I think there was a release yesterday from the Division of Travel and Tourism expecting $4.5 million in revenue to New Hampshire businesses this summer based on overnight stays. So that it is expected that people will continue to travel here and stay here. During the hearings in the Senate, we also heard about the solar eclipse that is going to happen in April of next year. And that bookings up north are already almost at capacity. So if you haven't yet, I would encourage you to make a booking if you'd like to view that. And then we also in the Senate talked a little bit about the presidential primary as well with respect to M&R and the fact that that can generate some hotel stays and some meals and meals consumed, drinks as well during that season. So it's all factors that need to be considered. And I think the Senate did take that into account when estimating their growth rate for M&R, thinking that some of these more special events may help bolster M&R as we go into the next 2 years.
Representative Platt?
Yes, the M and R,
Mhm.
people raise their rent rates because to cover their costs. That helps M and R.
Correct.
And we're coming out of a post-COVID lockdown essentially, so people are traveling, you're right, and spending money on meals. But could you see that ending? In other words, they won't stop going out, but slow down.
In all honesty, I thought we would have seen that already,
Yeah.
and we haven't. And so the way we kind of refer to it at the DRA when we're talking about it is kind of the new normal for M&R. We did expect a bump in M&R revenue coming out of COVID, but I expected that to kind of decrease pretty quickly, right? Everybody catches up on their vacations, realizes how much they like to eat out. They go out to dinner quite a bit, but then they would kind of resort to their old habits. But we seem to have sustained a higher level of M&R than we saw pre-pandemic. One of the things that was mentioned during the Senate hearings that may be driving up that revenue that may start to tail off is the pent-up demand for special events, weddings, business conferences, large gatherings of that sort. There was a lot of pent-up demand for that may have carried through the past few years. That may be trailing off, where you don't have, weddings 4 or 5 nights a week because you had 2 years of people, trying to get their events rescheduled. So that may tail off a bit.
Representative Almy.
Yes, I think it was about 10 years ago that I looked at the M&R rates for March, April, May versus, not March, April, May, but around the time the primary had happened, and outside of that time, and didn't see any correlation.
I'm not sure that it results in a noticeable increase in M&R when comparing to other months, but I think more my point was it might help to kind of sustain M&R in a period where it otherwise might be declining. So maybe not a noticeable impact in normal times, but it may help keep M&R at a higher rate when it otherwise would decline.
Representative Leapley.
Thank you. I'm looking at the differences column in FY 2024, and it looks like a large number is the business taxes and M&R, right? So I'm wondering what happens if the economy does slow down and those numbers let's say they look like the 2023 numbers, and the IND tax change passes. What would happen to our revenue situation as a state?
So I will mention that for business taxes and M&R, for the House for business taxes, your growth rate from 24 to 25 was just under -1%. You anticipated a decline in the tax. And then 24 to 25, you anticipated a 1.5% growth. The Senate had a 1% growth from 23 to 24 and a 1% growth from 24 to 25. So the House was a little more pessimistic, 23 to 24, and a little more optimistic, 24 to 25. For M&R, you anticipated a 1.5% growth from 23 to 24, and the Senate anticipated 2%. You anticipated 2.5% from 24 to 25, and the Senate anticipated 1.5. So your amounts are almost flipped. So I think over the biennium, you're fairly consistent in your growth rates, just maybe disagree on which year is going to be better than the other.
Okay.
In terms of the impact to IND, as Chris mentioned, that would show on the surplus statement. And so would be kind of accounted for after you agree on your revenue estimates.
But I think your question might be if your revenues don't come in as forecast, what happens? And essentially the answer is the expense side would need to be reduced if you budgeted to zero. But we don't know that that's going to occur yet. There may be, not every dollar will be budgeted.
Right.
Again, the Senate, the House didn't budget everything. There was some money that was going to go to the rainy day fund. The Senate will have a plan that will deposit some money to the rainy day fund. So there's a little bit of buffer in the surplus. I don't know what that number will be.
Okay. I think what I'm thinking of is everyone is kind of thinking through what might happen with the economy, and these numbers leave a lot of things out, right? All the expenses are left out. And I think the result, if these numbers go down more than we expect, is that, you know, more people would be homeless, more people would be unemployed, more people would need more services. So it kind of demands our expenses go up. But if our revenues go down, our expenses necessarily go down. And I'm not sure, again, because I'm new, how the rainy day fund is drawn on. Don't we have to have like a certain need before we can draw on that?
That's correct.
Can you
There's a
remind me what
process.
that
There's a
is?
process that at the end of the biennium, if there's a shortage in the revenue compared to your expenses, then money can be drawn from the rainy day fund. In the interim, it would be up to the executive side to manage budgets and to what you've seen are budget reductions in the past. When there's been an economic slowdown, the governors have had executive orders where they have said to agencies, you need to reduce your spend. And then they come before fiscal to get that adopted. So there's processes in place to look at that. The executive side will monitor their expenses if revenues aren't coming in. You know, at the end of the biennium, if there's a negative because revenues weren't there compared to the expenditures, then the rainy day fund would be drawn against to pay for that.
Representative Plett, and then we'll go
Yes.
around.
This has to do with the business profits tax, and I'm not going to question the numbers necessarily. This is a test of how vulnerable we are to changes, though, black swan events. What are we dependent on business profits tax for a couple of major multinationals creating most of it? So if let's say a GE falling apart over the last 4 years, if we had a major one like that, if it collapsed, how would we be affected?
So that's a good question. As we've shown in the triangles that we produce, the majority of business tax revenue comes from a few multinational corporations. However, I will note each year it's not necessarily the same few. So again, we'll use the pandemic as an example. The multinational corporations that may have been in the tip of that triangle before the pandemic were not the same corporations in the tip of the triangle during the pandemic because certain industries fared better than others. So again, it kind of goes back to we are in an okay place even if there are certain industries that are being impacted by various things. Where we start to worry is when every industry is feeling the impact of a downturn or a recession. If you have an industry like during COVID, like tourism, that was not performing as well, but you had another industry like healthcare that was performing well, they can kind of offset each other. But you are correct that the tip of that triangle tends to be large multinational corporations. And so if they are impacted, we could see an impact to that portion of the revenue.
Representative Phillips.
Thank you. One of the things that we've seen over the last couple years in terms of inflation has been rental costs. So I assume that landlords pay business profits tax in some cases. Do you see any indication that the rising rental prices are showing additional revenue coming into the state from that sector?
We have not analyzed that sector in particular, but it just with any sector, to the extent that prices are higher, whether it's rent, whether it's meals, whether it's the price of widgets that you sell, to the extent that prices are higher and that is hitting your profits, we will see an increase in business profits tax.
Follow up.
is it any income from rental of residential, apartments? Is that a very big sector at all in terms of the revenues coming from business profits?
I would say that's not a terribly large sector of the, I wouldn't want to venture a guess, but I would say it's not a terribly significant industry when you look at all of the business profits tax.
Representative Almy.
Thank you. Two things. Sorry, if large businesses pull out of the state or aren't selling into the state the way we are now, it affects the ones that actually were in our state also are not paying as much BET or any BET. So we really have to look at the effect from the two, it seems to me, on if we get into that kind of position. We're losing BET as well as BPT. But can't remember what the other one she brought up was.
So, Madam Chair, if we could finish going through the document, just so I can get you to the end of it before, I'm assuming you guys are going to try to break at noon, but I can keep you longer if you'd like.
We would love to break at noon, and we would love for you to continue presentation.
So just to finish up on the first page, you had the tobacco settlement was where we left off. You'll notice that the amount that came in April was 44.6 million. When you did your estimates, the Attorney General at that time thought 42. And you'll see that the plan amount was 36.3 million. So you can see how volatile that tobacco settlement revenue can be. So for the out years, the Senate just took the same estimate of 40 million and 38.5 million that was provided by the department. The utility property tax, the Senate was slightly less than the House. Again, it was just some of the ranges, the bases that were a little bit lower as it was presented to the Senate than it was for the House. Statewide education property tax, the same across the board. That's fairly easy, straightforward. We were hoping for debate, but there was none. Medicaid recoveries, you're going to see an adjustment there. The House had 2.6 million. The Senate came away with 3.4 million. To date, 3.1 million has been collected in recoveries. So the Senate felt 3.4 based on the plan amount was appropriate. And then looking at the 10-year trend that was reported in the ACFR, the Senate agreed that they should bump it up to 3 million in 24 and 25. And that's why you see the difference there. So that gets you to the bottom line that where you see the 63.2 million, 66.1, and the 55 million over the 3 years, which is the $184.3 million increase. So again, that's your general fund education trust funds. We've already gone over the bottom portion, which is the proposed changes to current law. The Senate hasn't completed that work, so there's nothing to show on their side of that. You can see what the House had agreed to on the left side. If you flip to page 2, I'm not going to go through every line, but I wanted to just point out, Representative Fellows had the question about the splits for the business tax and the going to the education trust fund and to the general fund, and that would be the second and third rows under changes to current law, and you'll see the general fund split for the House was 77.5% for both those, for the BET, BPT. The governor's proposal had been 65%. Same type of thing on the next page, which is the education trust fund. Again, you'll see the splits there at the 22.5%. Again, the Senate has made no decision on what they want to do with this aspect of House Bill 2. Then if I can take you to page 4. The top part of that is the highway fund estimates. So the road toll was identical for the House and the Senate. There were some slight adjustments in the motor vehicle fees presented by the Department of Safety, and that's what you see a 0.3 increase in fiscal year 23, and then a $1.2 million increase in 24 and 25. And then for the miscellaneous, it stayed at 200,000. And again, the miscellaneous is revenue that's generated by the Department of Transportation, mainly through the sale of surplus buildings and equipment. Excuse me, land and equipment. So if there's no questions on the highway fund, I'll bump you down to the fish and game fund. Again, there was no changes to the licenses, the 9.8 million in all 3 years for both the House and the Senate. There were some adjustments in the other revenue. One of the adjustments related to interest revenue. The fish and game fund is allocated revenue when the treasurer is able to gather that. So not all funds are portioned out a piece of the interest when they get that. It will go typically to the general fund. However, the fish and game fund has been seeing about $40,000 a month in revenue related to the interest. So the Senate accounted for that in the 3 years, as well as in the 24 and 25, the fish and game department had its unrefunded road toll and unrefunded marine toll, road tolls were at a flat level of 800, 900 respectively. But in the last few years, they've been collecting $1 million, $1.1 million. When questioned, the department agreed to bump each of those up by $100,000. So it was a $200,000 bump up in each year related to those unrefunded road tolls. So that's the difference in the fish and game area. So I just wanted to make sure we got to that. The last document, which I won't go through, but it is the worksheet. I think the benefit of that, if you're interested, is if you flip to page 4, you can see what revenues were in fiscal year 22. You can see what was the plan versus what was actually collected. Then you can see what the plan is for fiscal year 23. And then you can see what the governor, the House, what the agencies' high and lows were for the Senate, and then what the Senate estimates are. So it kind of gives you a one-shot look at the various stages of the revenue estimating. So again, I won't go through all that because it's really summarized, on that sheet we just went through. I think that, again, the reason that the chair invited us here today was to kind of go through what the Senate provided, to give you some information for the committee. So as you think about going forward, if there is a committee, a conference, or some other action that might be needed in terms of revenues, you at least have some base information to go by. All the documents that the agencies provided are on our website for both the House and the Senate. All the agency presentations were streamed on the YouTube. So if you went to the Senate Ways and Means, you'd be able to watch certain agencies if you wanted to hear what they testified to. So happy to answer any additional questions or go over anything, but just wanted to make sure we got you to the end because sometimes we miss the highway and fish and game.
Thank you so much, Representative Platt.
I just wanted to say thank you for the presentations and all the hard work you do to give the House and Senate some basis to estimate. Really appreciate it.
Representative Almy.
Yes, and we haven't gone through the DRA presentation, but since it's very similar to the one that we had before, we can probably handle it on our own.
Correct. That is the DRA presentation that's in front of you. That is what we presented to the Senate. It looks just like the presentation we gave to you. The only thing that changed was the high and low estimates for fiscal 23. So the only thing, as Chris already mentioned, that changed in that presentation was the high and low estimates for fiscal 23. The growth rates for 24 and 25 for every tax remained the same. And Chris has also summarized that presentation within his worksheets as well. But if you wanted to, I had trouble sleeping and you wanted to look at something, that might help.
And the reason why you changed your range is because the actual revenues coming in March and April were higher
Exactly. That's a great point. So we go through the same exercise for the Senate as we did for you. We look at year-to-date revenues. We run a few different scenarios to estimate out the remainder of the year. And then we analyze those scenarios to see which ones we think are actually the most likely to happen. And then we present those as our high and low ranges. So yes, it's just an update to year-to-date revenue and then running the scenarios.
Thank you very much. Any other questions, comments, discussion? Yes, Representative Almy.
I'd asked about the bank account on analysis the Fed does, but we might be able to get a little bit more up-to-date material on what's happening to the credit cards. And it'd be useful, I think, to get an idea about how nervous we are about the recession, which is the big question that none of us can answer. And have been talking about for 8 years, I think it is now.
So Representative Almy, are you asking the commissioner to come
Yes.
back to us with that? If that's,
Or to send it to us.
yeah,
or
if you have
whatever.
any articles or information that you could share, that'd be helpful. At this point, we probably wouldn't invite any outside speakers. This is something we want to keep our eye on, obviously, especially when the budget comes back to us and we get to see that. I thought of another question. Any other questions from the committee? Yep.
So once the Senate finishes up the budget side of it and we know what's in House Bill 2, I'll update the long sheets. So you'll see on the bottom what the proposed current law changes are. So you'll get an email at some point, probably at the beginning of June, that would tell you what the changes are that they're proposing to the taxes or other revenue impacts.
The other question I had was, when would you have a good idea on the May revenues?
Very early June. We'll have those. May doesn't tend to be a large revenue month. It's actually one of the lowest out of the whole year. June is the next month, unfortunately, that we see the largest amount of revenue coming in. So you'll get the revenue focus like you always do at the beginning of June for the month of May. You get our daily reports that we send out, but I'll make sure to mention or send a separate email if there's anything indicative or anomalous or anything in the May revenues that I think you should pay attention to. But otherwise, it should just be a pretty standard month. But I'll flag anything if I see it.
Representative Phillips.
Yes, because my printer won't do these, I'm wondering, since my printer at home won't do these, where can we pick one up maybe when you do the new ones?
Oh, you can just let me know if you need a hard copy and I'll make it available at the office.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the update. And folks, friendly reminder that this Thursday is a session, so we'll see you all there. Starts at 10. And then plan on next Tuesday and then the following Tuesday that we'll come back and do more work. Thank you. Somewhere around the 9:30 or 10, I did it a little earlier than I expected today because I wanted to make sure we left enough time for them. So, all right, thank you.